Okay, so for today, we will be discussing a passage from the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn from chapter 17. Okay, I'm going to start by reading this passage aloud. I'm going to start by reading this passage aloud, and then we'll just talk about your observations about this passage of the novel, and just talk about what the purposes behind this description might be, and maybe what Mark Twain is trying to communicate to us through this passage. Okay, so if you remember, this is during a scene in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn where the raft collides with a steamship and is crushed. And so Huck and Jim are struggling through the water, and Huck comes ashore and he finds a house. It's a large house of a well-to-do family, and he's sort of taken in there for a few days or a few weeks. And this is a description of some things in the house. Okay, and here's a picture of a house on the Mississippi that may have looked similar. All right, this is what Huckleberry Finn has to tell us about the house and the family. He says, "It was a mighty nice family and a mighty nice house, too. I hadn't seen no house out in the country before that was so nice and had so much style. It didn't have an iron latch on the front door nor a wooden one with a buckskin string, but a brass knob to turn, and the same as houses in a town. There weren't no bed in the parlor, not a sign of a bed, but heaps of parlors in towns has beds in them. There was a big fireplace that was bricked on the bottom, and the bricks was kept clean and red by pouring water on them and scrubbing them with another brick. Sometimes they washed them over with red water paint they called Spanish brown, same as they do in town. They had big brass dog irons that could hold up a saw log. There was a clock in the middle of the mantelpiece with a picture of a town painted on the bottom half of the glass front, and a round place in the middle of it for the sun, and you could see the pendulum swing behind it. It was beautiful to hear that clock tick, and sometimes when one of these peddlers had been along and scoured her up and got her in good shape, she would start in and strike 150 before she got tuckered out. They wouldn't took any money for her. Well, there was a big outlandish parrot on each side of the clock, made out of something like chalk and painted up gaudy. By one of the parrots was a cat made of crockery, and a crockery dog by the other, and when you pressed down on them they squeaked, but didn't open their mouths nor look different nor interested. They squeaked through underneath. There was a couple of big wild turkey-wing fans spread out behind those things. On a table in the middle of the room was a kind of lovely crockery basket that had apples and oranges and peaches and grapes piled up in it, which was much redder and yellower and prettier than real ones is. But they weren't real, because you could see where pieces had got chipped off and showed the white chalk or whatever it was underneath. Then we have a very short quote from chapter 18, where a young man of the Grangerford family is riding away and being chased by members of the Shepherdsons family with whom they're in sort of a blood feud. And when he realizes he's going to be overtaken, it says he turns around so as to have the bullet holes in the front, you know. So given this longer quote and this shorter quote, I'd like to hear what are some of your observations about this quote. Specifically, I have a couple questions listed here. What do many of the items in the family parlor have in common? And the second question, what seems to be important to this family? What observations do we have about this? What are some things that the objects described here have in common? And you can respond by raising your hand and speaking over the mic, or you can respond by typing into the chat box. Yes, Audrey, here's the mic for you.
I think for the first question, the Grangerford home seems to be just garnished with all these frivolous and fake items, almost like they were living in this real dollhouse that you could buy at a store. And they seem to love their life, their lush and rich life, and they just seem to care a lot about what they look like on the outside and their reputation.
Okay, so many of the items described are very artificial. We have the fake crockery, dog and cat. We have the fake fruit that's kind of chipped away a little bit. We have the bricks that are sort of painted over and scrubbed, and we have the artificial town scene on the clock. Um, I think it's also interesting that it says when the clock gets fixed up, it would strike 150 before getting tuckered out. Now, what would be the purpose behind a clock striking 150? What's the maximum number of strokes that a clock should realistically make at any given time? 12. Okay, that's a clock should strike numbers between 1 and 12. That's the job of a clock. That's as far as it would be useful. And so the fact that he says this clock would, it could strike 150, sort of what's the point of that? It seems to they sort of it goes overboard sometimes. Okay, the family seems to value keeping up appearances, sometimes to the extreme, right? Sometimes to the extreme, like with the clock striking 150. Far beyond the utility of any clock. So let's see the comments here. Living on the raft, Huck finds value only in the things he needs to stay alive, but the Grangerfords find worth in all these items that only have appearance value. Yeah, of all these items that Huck describes that are really, that he says, these are really nice, these are just like things they have in town, most of these are useless. Many of them are useless. The clock has, the clock has a purpose, but it's not really clear that they use the clock for its intended purpose, right? It's not really clear that they actually care whether the clock tells time well. They just like the look of it, right? They'll get it fixed up so that it will strike 150, then get tired out, and then, presumably sort of slow down and stop before they get it fixed up again. The fireplace bricks have a purpose too, right? The fireplace bricks have a purpose too, but the dogs, cats, fruits, artificial parrots, things like that, the family is immensely proud. So the Grangerfords are immensely proud of the non-utilitarian, mostly artificial possessions that they have on display. Now, here's another question, and I'll read these other comments in the chat box in just a second. But we see a lot of comparisons to houses in town, so it's very clear this house is out in the country, right? This house is out in the country. So, who is this display of possessions for? Whom exactly are they trying to impress? Faith, yes, here's a mic for you.
Okay, so actually in the comments I have about it, I basically answer that question. So Huck notices how elite this family is, and what seems to be of import to the Grangerford family is riches. All the items in the parlor may be glistening, but are fake and only material. They put a lot of weight on material things and relations rather than nurturing personal relationships. We learned that they have a feud with the Shepherdsons, not wishing to make amends. They'd rather basically outdo them in material aspects, in their possessions, and displaying their possessions, rather than nurture their relationship with them and fix their relationship. So I think they are displaying these possessions partially for the Shepherdsons, I have no idea how to say that, Shepherdsons or whatever, because of their feud that's going on. So they're trying to outdo their so-called enemy or whatever in possessions.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so for one thing, they're trying to, so there are two answers to this, right? There are two answers to this. For one thing, the display is partly for the Shepherdsons, part of an effort to outdo them in wealth, appearances, and possessions. So they've been involved in this feud with the Shepherdson family for several generations, and they no longer have a very clear idea of what the feud is all about, right? They have a hard time remembering exactly how it started. There are a few different stories. They're not sure which one is true. They're not really sure anymore why the Shepherdsons family are their enemies. They're not really sure why anymore, but it's very important that they are. So the display of possessions is partly for the Shepherdsons. Even if the Shepherdsons never see these items in person, they will sort of find out about them somehow. Um, and but then on the other hand, that's still not a very public audience for their display, right? Their display of possessions and their preoccupation with appearances is also just for themselves, right? They get satisfaction out of their own appearance, out of the appearance of their own possessions and the appearance of their own sort of conduct and their own sort of personal excellence, right? They do it for themselves and for their enemies, for themselves and for the Shepherdsons. Notice that there's never, in these two chapters when Huck is with the Grangerford family, I don't believe, and correct me if you know of a passage where it talks about this, but we don't have accounts of the Grangerford family actually interacting with other people or having other friends. They seem to be so absorbed in their feud with the Shepherdsons. They have enemies, right? They have enemies, and they put on appearances for themselves, but they don't really appear to have people to impress or people to interact with or be friends with apart from the Shepherdsons whom they hate. Another thing to point out, I typed this up a little bit above. Not only are the items fake, but they're visibly fake, right? You can easily tell how fake these things are. Okay, it's very easy to see through the display. Everything seems to be mostly about the appearance and general aesthetic. It's all very fake and artificial. The items themselves don't seem very valuable or necessary, right? And it says about the clock, it says they wouldn't took any money for her. Well, how much money would someone really offer them? We don't really know how useful the clock is. It's kept as an item of display. Okay, the Grangerfords appear to put a lot of stock in displaying their wealth where they know it will be noticed by whoever happens to be in the parlor, right? But we don't actually hear about, during the time that Huck is with them, I think we don't actually hear about other people coming into the parlor. We don't hear about the Grangerfords having visitors. The family seems to take pride in how everything looks. They show their wealth by possessions other people can see. Most of the items don't seem to be useful. Just for show pieces to get attention and praise. One thing I noticed at first, I'm reading your comment, Nehemiah. One thing I noticed at first is how Huck, who's been described and gone on as an average country boy, knows a lot about the nice things in town, and in particular the items of the rich family. Yeah, so where do you think he gets all this information that, oh, this is just like houses in town, right? Or this is even better than houses in town. Do you think he says that from experience, or do you think he's been told that by the Grangerford family? Do you think maybe they're describing their possessions for him and saying, this parlor is just like parlors in town. Our doorknob is just like doorknobs in town. The parlor would most likely have been a place where they entertained equally wealthy and elite families. And he guessed even Huck, who is essentially a country boy and a vagabond, is bound to notice their extravagant style. Yeah, maybe he's been told, maybe he's read about it in books, maybe the family boasts about maybe the comparisons. So throughout this passage, we get frequent comparisons with things you would see in town. Maybe it's important to them that they tell people, right? Maybe it's important to them. Now, Huck did live in a small town before he embarked on this adventure, so it could be that he's comparing it to experience, but it could also be that that the Grangerford family is careful to make it known that, oh, we're just as good as people in town, and our house is just as fancy as people in town, as houses in town. So this is a question. He doesn't exactly tell us. Does Huck get this from experience, or do the Grangerfords emphasize how their things are just as nice or nicer than things in town? So yes, it could be from experience. It could be from experience, or it could be that the family is emphasizing this. Another thing I'd like to point out. So what's the relationship between this description of the parlor and this description of all these items in the parlor and this really short quote we have here from chapter 18, where the young man turns around on his horse so as to have the bullet holes in the front? What's the relationship between those two quotes? What's the relationship between those two quotes? Why are those two things related? Seem to be blind to what really matters, like staying alive, right? The young man decides to stop trying to escape. He would rather have the bullet holes in the front than to have a chance at staying alive and getting away from the people who are trying to kill him. Right. Yes. So the importance of appearances. The importance of appearances. The young man values the appearance of bravery over the hope of staying alive. Right. So, I mean, you wouldn't want to die a coward, but is it cowardly to run away from people who are trying to kill you? If you're in a battle, yes, but he was being ambushed on the road. Yeah, this was not a situation of sort of turning around and retreating in battle. He was riding along the road and had been ambushed, was being pursued by people who were trying to kill him, in a non-military, in a civilian situation. Okay. So this extreme overemphasis on appearances, and appearances that are really artificial. Now,